Hello, everybody. This is Hugo Slim in Geneva. I'm head of policy at the ICRC, and it's a great pleasure for me today to be hosting this peer-to-peer webinar on education. We've got two great speakers to give us their critical insights and analysis on a topic that's really prioritized in humanitarian operations. Before we do that, though, I want to talk a little bit further. I want to tell you who's with you. We've got a very good group today, and pretty diverse, actually. We've got 75% of people registered have worked for more than 5 years in humanitarian work. We've got people from 80 countries registered. We've got about 66% registered profiles are not UN, so that's very encouraging. 51% registered profiles from the field, so just a tiny majority of field people, and the rest of you, I presume, are humanitarian bureaucrats like me. So thanks very much for coming and listening today. Let me tell you how the webinar is going to work. The webinar will last for 60 minutes. During the first 30 minutes, I'll be asking questions to our two speakers, and they'll be giving us some reflections and answers to these questions. Then the second 30 minutes are really yours, and I'll be taking questions from the audience then. We'll be choosing questions here. But before we get started, I need to give you some technical guidance and some ground rules that we should live by during the webinar. So the first one is that you should stay on mute, please, through the course of this webinar, and also have your camera turned off at all times. The second one is please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your WebEx window to communicate with everyone on this webinar. The third one is if you've got questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A box on the right-hand side so we can see them too. And please note the number 4, that we'll be running 2 polls during the course of this webinar, and please respond to them, and then we can see the results of what you all think on a couple of different questions. Rule number 5, if you've got any issues connecting to this webinar, please contact Venkatesh Naik, who's sitting next to me, and we'll try and sort them all out. Or you can watch an interactive feed on YouTube. And also the last thing is we'll be recording this webinar, and an edited version will be uploaded onto YouTube. So please look at that. You can find other useful webinar recording on the STAIT website or the YouTube channel. Good, so that's how we're going to do this. And now I want to introduce the topic, which is education. And of course, as we all know, the primary purpose of humanitarian assistance is to save lives and reduce the suffering of people affected by a crisis. And this usually includes all the things we're used to in humanitarian work, like emergency shelter, clean water, health, sanitation, food, protection, and other forms of assistance that evidently save lives. I think it's fair to say that nobody questions the importance of education in a sort of development context as a very profound personal and public good in all our lives. And this is reflected obviously in SDG 4, which says that everyone should ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning for all. But what we need to think about today is the tough question. Is education really so important in humanitarian crisis when saving people's lives is really our true measure of success, or protecting them from danger? Children's education today is probably one of the greatest casualties of war in many people's opinions. It's often not prioritized in humanitarian responses, which tend to favor shelter, healthcare, water. Education perhaps gets left behind, and particularly children's education, and can be misperceived as not immediately critical to save lives. It's therefore possibly the first service that's sacrificed both by governments and by humanitarian workers and development workers in an effort to respond to other things. And it's often the last service to be rebuilt as well after a crisis is over. The Global Monitoring Report, and I'm going to quote from it because it's quite interesting what their view is. They say insufficient humanitarian and development aid systems, together with insufficient levels of domestic financing, are excluding millions of children and adolescents from education. the epicenter of the basic education crisis is in these emergency settings. And yet in 2014, for instance, 1% of overall humanitarian aid and 2% of humanitarian appeals went to leaving millions of children and their families without a way to build a future. So to talk through this issue, and it is very much an issue of the day in the humanitarian sector, I'm delighted to welcome two great people who are particularly proactive and determined to prioritize education in emergencies in the countries where they're working. First of all, it's a great pleasure to introduce Lise Grande, who's the humanitarian coordinator and resident coordinator and deputy special representative of the Secretary General in Yemen. Lise from the UN, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for joining. And our second guest is Sarah Skovgaard, who is the Education Cluster Coordinator for UNICEF in Somalia. Sarah, thank you for joining us too. So we have two really committed people, committed to education, from two of the most challenging contexts in the humanitarian sector today. Thank you both for coming. And Lise, I'm going to start with you, if I may, and ask you the question of the day, really. The primary purpose of humanitarian aid is to save lives and reduce suffering. So can we really justify education as a priority in a humanitarian operation?
Hugo, this is Lise. Can you hear us from Sana?
Yeah, I can hear you. Good to hear you.
Hugo, we're absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm joined by the very exceptional UNICEF team that has done so much to promote education here. You've asked a very important and in some ways provocative question, and if you allow, I would like to share our response as follows. Education is important in emergencies for all the reasons we say we care about what we do. We say that we care that for families who are facing the most difficult conditions they will ever face in their lives, and structure. Education does exactly that. We say that for families who are facing the most difficult conditions they ever will in their lives, that part of our responsibility as humanitarians is to give these families a sense of direction and hope that they will get out of the situation that they will be able to take another.
Lise, we're now struggling to hear you a bit. We were hearing you very well before.
We say that we care about protecting and preserving social cohesion in conditions that are ripping communities apart. Education does exactly that. We say that we are committed to developing community class.
Lise, this is Hugo. We're struggling to hear you. If you could speak very close to the mic, please. Sorry, everybody. We seem to have slight problems with Yemen, but I hope we're going to get Lise back. Lise, I'm going to let you try and solve your comms problem. I'm sorry to miss you at this point, and I'm going to go to Sarah. Sarah, I hope you can hear us. And I'm going to pick up a question for you, Sarah. The peer-to-peer project recently visited Somalia. The scale of the crisis there, as you know, is overwhelming, with so many different issues on the table, like drought and flooding, insecurity, humanitarian access. How did you manage to get education on the agenda amongst all these competing priorities?
Hey, Hugo, thanks a lot, and I hope we get Lisa back online. But yeah, thank you for the question, and just to give maybe a little bit of background to the main crisis we were facing last year in Somalia, which was a very large-scale drought on the brink of famine. and we had more than 6.4 million people who were in need of humanitarian assistance. In January, there was a famine alert that was sent out. It was including Yemen as well, so it wasn't only Somalia that was facing this crisis, and it meant a significant scale-up of the response in Somalia. And as you were mentioning in the beginning, Hugo, the core clusters or the core sectors are often favored, right? And it was the same in our response in Somalia, where it was mostly focused on food security and water, hygiene, as well as nutrition and health. And that makes perfect sense when you have a drought situation and people are basically dying of hunger, right? So for education, we were trying to find out how do we include education in such narrow response. And education in Somalia is, on any given day, in a crisis, right? There are more than 70% of the school-age children, they are not in school, right? But we were realistic enough to know that this was not the time to advocate for access to education for all of these out-of-school children in the middle of the situation that was deteriorating. So instead, we were advocating for and focusing on the school as a hub or an entry point to provide life-saving services for this very particular and vulnerable group which children are. And this was very much based on the previous famine, which had been there just a few years earlier in 2011, where children were one of the main victims of the crisis, right? So a strong focus on keeping the kids alive. And by doing this, we were able to show or to convince our colleagues that we were, in principle, providing the same narrow response and providing food and water and healthcare, but we were doing it through this community structure, which the school often is, right? And the added value of that was not only were we keeping kids alive, we were ensuring they were in a protected environment, the school, and they also had the future ahead of them still, right? They were able to continue their learning throughout the crisis. Yeah, so we had to take a very pragmatic approach, and the feedback we got from the leadership in the humanitarian sector in Somalia was that it was appreciated that we were being pragmatic and we were willing to adapt to the situation. And I think we were able to push this through also because we had incredibly consistent messaging, right? We were all in the education sector and with our cluster lead agencies, UNICEF and Save the Children and all our partners, we were committed to having this very targeted strategy, right? So our key message was food and water for the kids, have them in the schools, let them be protected, let them stay in school throughout the crisis. And it's not always, I think, that education people agree to that approach, because, you know, education is a right and education in its own should be prioritized as a humanitarian response. But I do personally think sometimes we have to be more pragmatic and look at what's the added value of education in a response, right? What is it we can do with education that we can't do through other sectors? Yeah.
Sarah, that's great. Thank you very much. So I like that idea very much, that you're basically saying it, you know, education is not just education, it's a hub that can provide multiple assistance and protection services. What role do the clusters play in all this? They're often considered the engine room of humanitarian response. How have you managed to convince donors to set up and support education through the clusters?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think one of the great challenges we have in education, right? And I think across all emergencies in the world, education is hugely underfunded, right? It's very rare that education is actually getting the funding that is needed to reach all the children, and that was also and is a major challenge for the education cluster in Somalia. So again, last year in this pre-famine response, we had an appeal for education on 33 million, and we managed to get $20 million dollars coming in, which is good for education in Somalia. It's higher than the years before, right? But we also had to consider that it was a scaled-up response. There was more money coming in general, and if we look at it overall, the 20 million to education was only 1.4% of the total amount coming in, right? So education is still a very small part of the overall response. But I think for us, we were lucky in the sense that we got funding from Education Cannot Wait, which is a new global fund that is focusing on, they have different funding windows, and we got funding through their first response window, but they're also focusing on building bridges from humanitarian to development work, right? So in our situation, we had started out the response with funding through the country humanitarian fund, and we had a very broad and short-term response, hoping that by the middle of the year last year, we would see the rains and we would be through the worst of the crisis, right? Unfortunately, that did not happen, and that was the time when the Education Cannot Wait funding came in. So it was perfect timing, and that allowed us to sustain the response we had and even scale it up a little bit so we could support the children throughout the rest of the year, waiting for the next rain season again, right? We also had a few donors like EU and the Global Partnership for Education who were willing to let partners reprogram. It's not always the case. I think there can be some watertight, distinctions between humanitarian development donors and what they want to spend their money on. But there was a strong argument that if the development donors were not willing to let the partners reprogram, the results in the development programs wouldn't be achieved anyways because they would be hampered by the ongoing emergency, right? So that was helpful as well. I think now, over the course of this last year, we've seen globally a bit more attention to education. And of course, the establishment of the Education Cannot Wait Fund has helped significantly, right? But I also think that other donors are stepping up. ECHO, for instance, have globally stepped up their commitments to education significantly. And in Somalia, we have benefited from that. So as a follow-up to that first response window, education sector was receiving in the drought crisis last year. Somalia is now being considered for the multi-year funding, which is this 3-year funding that is bridging between humanitarian and development funding, which makes a lot of sense in education, right? Because education is a process, and it's obvious that you want to make that connection. Yeah, ECHO funding. Yeah.
That's lovely, thank you. And I think that's a very powerful point that, in a sense, education is such a logical nexus investment, in a sense. And I think you make that point extremely well. Thank you. I'm going to see if we got Lise with us again. Lise, are you there?
I want to speak.
Lise, have we got you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. That's great, Lise. Thank you so much. Sorry about that technical problem.
Yeah,
I'm just going to ask that question again. Yeah, so tell us, how do you justify education in the midst of such immediate suffering?
The point that we started to make, and again, I'm sorry to all of our colleagues for having lost the connection, is that so many of the values which we say are at the center of humanitarian action are done very effectively, in fact, arguably the best, by our education colleagues and by the work that education clusters do. And when we were thinking about how to describe these, myself and our exceptional UNICEF team put down a list of the values that we think matter so much to humanitarian action generally, and which we know that education clusters promote. And these include giving families who are facing the worst conditions they will ever face in their lives a sense of stability and structure, giving these same families a sense of direction and hope that they will get out of the conditions that they are currently facing, and that the experience and the reality of displacement will not condemn them to lives of despair. We also believe very strongly that promoting education is a way of preserving and protecting social cohesion. Likewise, a point that's been made earlier, it's very clear that education institutions in many communities are the entry point for all kinds of collective activities, and that if you promote educational facilities, you promote those institutions, you have much wider impact across a whole series of social practices that are crucially important for communities that are under stress. And the other point, and I think this is very clear, all of the surveys show when you actually ask people, you ask families, what matters to you? What do you care most about? Right at the top of the list, every single time, is getting their kids in school. If we take the agenda of accountability to affected populations seriously, if we really believe in that, it's absolutely clear that we have a collective responsibility to put education at the top of what we do. There is one other point that I think we all recognize and that we can't stress enough. When children and young people are in school, they are at lesser risk of being recruited as child soldiers and child laborers. The risk of early and forced marriages is significantly reduced, as is other forms of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And it's for all of these reasons that many, many humanitarian coordinators are increasingly recognizing that the work that the education clusters and education partners do has to be at the center of our collective action.
Lise, thanks a lot. That's a really clear answer. And of course, one of the most powerful things you said is that people want it. And I think, as you say, that must be where we start as a humanitarian community. Can I go on to ask you, can you just illustrate some concrete steps? So we've got a clear view of why the people want it, how it's important, how schools can be entry points. What do you actually get up and do in the morning, or what does your team get up and do in the morning to make that step and make education happen for children in Yemen?
The approach that we took when, and let me be frank here, when we didn't have the resources that we needed, was to make sure that there was a minimum standard of education availability for the families that were most in distress. So that meant that we did everything we could to keep facilities open. In places where there weren't facilities, we established alternative learning spaces. It also meant that we kept focused on making sure that there were sufficient supplies in these facilities so that kids had and teachers had what they needed in order to make learning go forward. There's something else that's been very important about our action in Yemen, and that is the monitoring that our education teams and partners do of what's happening in education facilities. Every time there's an airstrike, every time there's shelling, every time a facility is struck, we monitor that and we tell the world about it. Right? We make sure that the attack on civilian infrastructure, and most importantly education, is right at the center of our protection work. Now, there's something else that we did here in Yemen, and talk about fortuitous timing. 2 days ago, we had 2 donors that stepped forward, and they have just given UNICEF $70 million in order to cover teacher allowances for 135,000 teachers across Yemen who were not getting paid. Now, this is exceptional. Donors very rarely in these settings will step forward and do what's necessary to keep the teachers' payroll intact. But they did it in Yemen, and they did it because our humanitarian country team said, in this context, we will not forget education. We will not leave it behind. It will not be the cluster of last response. It will be the thing that, above all, we say is the most important. We're going through a moment in Yemen where our key donors are reassessing their priorities. And we took advantage of that moment and stepped forward and said, the thing that matters is covering that payroll. And 2 donors did that. It has literally doubled the education budget for all of our humanitarian partners and is a remarkable step. Almost never do we have donors that will cover a teacher's payroll as part of a humanitarian operation. They've done it here in Yemen, and it's a testament to UNICEF and the education cluster's singular leadership.
Liz, that's very good to hear, and it's obviously important. It's obviously important for the children, but it's obviously important for those adults around them who are now going to be properly paid again as teachers. Can I just push you a bit on this question? I mean, we've been talking largely about children, why education, why schools as multi-entry hubs are good for children. Are we talking about a bias towards children here? What is good for adults about prioritizing children's education?
I mean, I think that what's so important about education is the role that it plays in giving families stability and in promoting social cohesion. And again, the evidence on this is absolutely clear. When education facilities are shut down or curtailed, the impact on communities is immediate and it's dramatic. When families don't have a sense that their children are going to make it out of this experience with something to live for and with training, then those families give up hope. It's also very clear that education is a crucial confidence-building measure as communities move from conflict and toward peace. It's for all of these reasons that this is one of the most important things we do, as important for children as it is for adults.
So you seem to be saying, and Sarah, I'm going to come back and ask you the same question, that we are now talking about equality between health, water, education. You would see these as equally important now in a humanitarian response.
I paused to think about this because, and I hope this comment isn't misunderstood, but in our country teams, because education has very often been marginalized, and it was in Yemen. It was the cluster that got funded last. It was the cluster that was excluded from the pooled fund. It was the cluster that was in at the end of the humanitarian response plan. In order to pivot and to bring education to its rightful place, we almost, in a sense, said it was a higher priority than other things. And I want to be really clear about that. It wasn't just that we were bringing education to its rightful place. We literally, as a country team, said, if you look at what's happening right now, we have to make sure that above all, we prioritize this aspect of our work. Now, it wasn't at the expense of other clusters. Yemen right now is facing one of the largest, potentially worst famines that we've seen in living memory. We're not saying that education replaces what we do to improve food security. We're not saying that education replaces the efforts that we've made to combat the largest cholera outbreak in modern history. We're not saying that education replaces the work that's being done to fight malnutrition. But what we are saying is that education has to be prioritized, has to get our attention. We have to bring resources to it, and we have to do that in a deliberate way. If we don't, it remains on the margins.
Lise, thank you for that very clear answer. Sarah, I just want to come back to you before we go to the audience for their questions. And I want to ask you about protection and education. Could you say a little bit more about the link between protection and education programming?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a super important point, right? Because when we are promoting education in prolonged conflicts and crisis situations and in famine situations, what have you, protection is one of, at least again in my point of view, one of the most important things about education, right? We ensure when children are going to school, we can keep them out of harm's way, away from early child marriages, away from child labor, away from gender-based violence or other abuses that they are much more likely to get exposed to if they are roaming around and are not in a safe and protected environment that the school can be, right? And again, we have this structure that is so embedded in the community where the kids are coming and there is a level of trust to the people that are there. And if we work with our teachers to make sure that they are equipped to provide basic psychosocial support, or at least recognize when kids are traumatized and need support, they can refer them to the further child protection services that are, right? It's a perfect opportunity to look after the kids because you have a whole bunch of kids there together in the same space, right? I do think one thing which is really important when we talk about protection in education, and it is something that I think we should always mention together, but we also have to make sure that the schools are indeed safe, right? Because as Lisa was mentioning from Yemen, and we see the same in Somalia, when schools are attacked, if they become a target for shelling or for mortar attacks, or if other forms of attacks are happening on schools, then it's not a safe space, right? And we are promoting it as a safe and protective environment for the children to be. So we also have the responsibility to make sure that it is safe.
Sarah, thank you. And I'm very glad you raised that point. I mean, I'm sitting in Europe, and of course North America and Australia and other places have had similar scandals where children have been extremely badly abused in schools. So safeguarding, which is now such an important issue for our humanitarian sector, is something that always has to be done alongside education programming, and it's very good to hear you say that. We're getting some good questions coming in from people now, so I'm going to move on. And Lisa, I'm going to give you the first one because it raises another question about gender and about ethnic group and whatever. It's a question of impartiality, and it is this: what specific work has been done to mitigate the inequality issue in the access to education in emergencies? And that inequality, as I say, could be gender-based or group-based or anything.
What's been very important in the way that we've tried to ensure that both boys and girls get access to education facilities is to make sure that special needs are met. You know, this includes washing facilities. It includes sanitation facilities that are appropriate for young girls. If you don't have those in place, then there's going to be significant family and community pressure for girls not to go to school. And this is why the work that our education partners are doing is matched very carefully with the work that our WASH partners are doing. It's also crucially important that we knew which areas the schools were not functioning in. You know, more than 60% of all education facilities in the country aren't working, but that's not evenly spaced. And this is why the evidence base was so important for what we do. We had to know where the schools were working. We had to know where the teachers were not going to school. We had to have this kind of base so that we could target our interventions to ensure that all areas were covered. Something else that's been very important about the way that the education partners have responded in Yemen is to make sure that there are more and more female teachers. Right? And this has been a critical aspect of ensuring equality of opportunity and equality of the teaching experience. Those are three important things we've done here.
That's very helpful, thank you. And so that, you know, making a clear case there for inclusion and impartiality. So those two values really in humanitarian action must be applied to prevent different forms of discrimination in educational access. That's great. We've got another good question here, and it's probably a bit about the curriculum. We've talked about schools as spaces, safe spaces, multi-purpose spaces. How do we design conflict-sensitive programs in conflict areas so that, in a sense, we are not supporting schools which may be promoting aspects of the conflict, hatred towards one group or another, a certain kind of dominant view of history, etc.? How do we manage curriculum in a conflict-sensitive way, and can we? Sarah, I'm going to go to you for that one. Thank you. Sorry, you're on mute, apparently. Maybe it was such a hard question that you've deliberately muted. Let's hear you.
No, sorry, you need to repeat the question. I just lost my connection, so I didn't hear you there.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, well, it's a question about curriculum, really. How do we make, how can we, do we have a right to make sure that curriculum in schools, the type of things people are being taught in schools, are conflict sensitive, and that in fact we're not just supporting schools that are really a deep part of the conflict and promoting hatred, promoting versions of history, etc. How do we can we manage conflict-sensitive curriculum in schools?
I think that's a really good question. It's a difficult one in many senses, right? But of course, we have to, as much as we can, make sure that curriculum and curricula is conflict sensitive. That's our responsibility, right? But we also have to, at least when when it's possible, we have to recognize that the government is the duty bearer and the main entity responsible for education, right? And at least in a Somalia context, where we've seen more than 14 different curricula, because the system has been broken down for so many years. Now that the Ministry of Education is promoting one national curriculum, education cluster, and the key partners we have in the education sector is doing all they can to try and work with the government on making sure that this national curriculum that is now being developed and rolled out is conflict sensitive, right? And is not causing further conflict between the different clans or what the different reasons why there are conflict in Somalia, right? Another point related to curriculum, which is really, really important, at least in the Somalia context, is when we do support the government in being able to have one national curriculum, we can also limit the space that radical groups have to promote their education. Yeah, because we do see radical groups, they take over education because people, as Lisa was mentioning also, they do want education, right? And if there is not a strong national curriculum, there is space for these different groups to promote a curriculum which is radicalizing children and young people and is causing more conflicts than unity and the peace, right? So very important.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a helpful answer. You mentioned the role of government, and our next question is about that. Elise, if you could take this one. What is the role of government towards education in emergencies? And can you talk a bit about, pick up where Sarah left off, and how is the Yemeni government able to support education, either in setting policy or actually investing and supporting education?
In the case of Yemen, we have the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Its ministries are based in the city of Aden, and then we have de facto authorities based in Sana'a, and there are Ministry of Education representatives, of course, in both locations. What's been very clear is that the primary goal of the ministries has been to ensure that education facilities continue to operate. And this has really been about two things: the teachers' payroll and operational budgets. Now in Yemen, there was a very pioneering relationship that developed between the World Bank and the UN family. The World Bank had massive IDA-supported education and social protection programs throughout the country. When the conflict started and the bank was in a position where they had to suspend those vitally important programs, for one of the first times in their history, they reached out to the UN and they said, can we discuss with you how we keep these programs going? In the case of education, it's been UNICEF that has been supporting capitation budgets for schools to make sure that there are minimum operation costs in place. As I said, we have just successfully, under UNICEF's leadership, mobilized funding for the payroll for 135,000 teachers in areas where teachers were not getting paid and schools were shut as a result. Let me touch a little bit on the issue of curriculum, because it is sensitive, and in many ways it can become a political minefield. In the case of Yemen, there clearly were educationalists who wanted to change the curriculum. They wanted to alter it. Now, the education teams, they monitor things very carefully. They're constantly reviewing things like the curriculum. There's a lot of training that goes on with teachers on conflict sensitivities, how you actually work in a conflict setting and educate children in a good way, in a way that doesn't spread hatred and lead to partisanship. But this issue of the curriculum was there, and there were attempts to change it. And here there was a really important position that was taken. And what we said was, we need to keep the original curriculum. That was a curriculum that spread across the country. It was a curriculum which defined the national project, and it's important that that curriculum continue. And that was, in a sense, a condition, a line that we drew. We engaged with authorities, and the original curriculum has not been politicized, and we engaged with authorities to ensure that was the case, and it's very gratifying that the curriculum remains in place.
Lise, thank you for that, the important points about curriculum. And I just want to move now. We've talked about government authority and the role of government, but there's a very good question here. How have you, and I'm going to ask this to Sarah, thinking of Somalia, how have you managed to maximize meaningful community parent engagement in education processes when their attention is often focused on survival? So how, we can include children, but how have we included parents in the planning, design, delivery of education?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I can answer that much in details, as at least, you know, in the education cluster, all the implementation is done by the partners, right? So it's the partners who are on the ground, who are designing the projects together with the communities. So as education cluster, we're not necessarily all the way down there engaging with the community directly, right? But parents are very much engaged, and in Somalia we have community education committees, similarly to parent-teacher associations in other countries. And the partners do focus a lot on engaging parents, because bottom line, if parents don't see the added value of sending their child to school, they will not go to school, right? So it's important to make it clear to the parents what's the added value of sending their child to school, especially their girls. But it's also super important to listen and find out if the parents do have any concerns, or if they do see barriers to why they are not sending their kids to school, that this is being addressed in the program. Right? So parents are very very engaged in that sense. These committees are also engaged when different activities are being selected. For instance, we have some girls' education programs running in Somalia, and some of these girls are selected for scholarships. Yeah, so their school fees are being paid, and the community and the parents, and through these community education committees, are very much involved in setting up the criteria for selecting the girls who are receiving the scholarships, in order not to create conflict down the line, right? But ensure that there is an agreement about how are we distributing these resources that are coming into the community. And it seems to be working quite well, and the partners are are paying a lot of attention to having a conflict-sensitive approach to their project development and engagement with the community.
Sarah, thank you very much. We've got a couple more good questions, but before we do those, I want to remind you about the poll. I want you to do the poll, the questionnaire that you've seen, but all the time listening as well, at the same time as you do it. That would be great. The next question I want to come to is one of my own, actually. And we've talked, I think, primarily about primary education. And a lot of the images we've had up on the screen as we've been talking have been of small children, sort of, you know, under 12. Lise, can you tell us about the difference of doing programming for primary education and secondary education? And are we realistically largely talking about children under 12 in humanitarian education programs?
Hugo, in the case of Yemen, part of the reason why we really went straight at the payroll. It's honestly the heart of the matter, and we knew that. And we're talking about all teachers in northern Yemen. We're talking about primary teachers, middle, and secondary teachers. And we didn't, make the distinction of focusing only on primary school. We were talking about all education facilities, and for the reasons that you suggest. We didn't want there to be a situation where there were facilities for some young people and not for others. And central to that was ensuring that the basic education system functioned, and central to that was making sure that teachers received an allowance so that they could continue to sustain themselves and their families. We were literally in a position where schools were closing because teachers just couldn't support themselves. They had absolutely no income and no alternative income. There was a very poignant story that was told to me by one of the government officials. He had gone back to his own village, way up in the mountains, and he goes to his village, and he goes to the school, and there were a group of 15 children who had walked several kilometers to go to school, and they sat in that classroom, and they waited for the teacher. And the teacher didn't come. And this colleague says to the children, your teacher isn't going to come. And the children turned to him and they said, yes, they will, and we will wait for them. And, this is why we understood that it wasn't about just constructing some facilities, and it wasn't just about some workshops. We had to find a way to make sure that the system as a whole worked. And that meant going against the assumptions about what were priorities and mobilizing $70 million to cover not just primary education, but 135,000 teacher allowances. There are nearly 4 million children that are out of school here. And because of the work that the education teams have done, those kids are now going to have a chance to get into school. In a context like Yemen, it's absolutely miraculous.
Lise, that's very good to hear. Sarah, can I ask you the same question? Because obviously you're in a very different context. So how are you balancing primary, middle, and secondary education in your Somalia context?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question, and you were mentioning the SDG 4 when we started, right? And globally, we do have a focus on lifelong learning and the whole cycle of education, right? But I would say in reality in Somalia, where the system is very broken, unfortunately, right? The main focus tends to be on primary education. We do, as education cluster, we target school-age children, which is 5 to 18. So it does include older students as well. But there are not very many secondary school facilities in Somalia, unfortunately, right? And when you are building up a system, of course, you need to have the whole range, because otherwise, where are the children going to transition to? But I think it's a process. I will say, though, that one program which is often implemented in emergencies education programs is accelerated learning programs or alternative basic education programs. It's called a little bit different. But that program is targeting overaged children, right? And overaged in the sense that you might be 13 and you haven't had a chance to go to school, and you shouldn't be put into grade 1, but you are at grade 1 level, right? And what they do in these programs, they accelerate the primary school curriculum into half the time, and then they take in these older students and give them a chance to catch up quite quickly through better teaching methodology and more resources and what have you. And that's a quite effective program for a group of children that are often young people that are often left out when we are trying to provide education in emergencies and end up focusing on primary education, right?
Sarah, thank you. We've got two more very good questions that I want to get to, but I also want to comment on the photographs, because some of these photographs we're seeing in front of us as we talk and discuss are incredibly moving and powerful in the way that both Lise and Sarah have emphasized what, the lengths people will go, where they will go to try and make a classroom and bring education to life. I find that very powerful, and I hope you're all able to see them as well. Right, I've got a couple more questions that I want to focus on towards the end. We've had lots of really good questions, and thank you all very much for those. The first one is probably a bit of an ICRC question, actually, but I don't know who it came from. And it is, how do you ensure that education happens in non-government controlled areas? For example, in al-Shabaab controlled areas in Somalia. So Sarah, I'm going to come back to you, and then I'd like to ask that same question to Lise in Yemen as well. Sarah.
Yeah, that is a very, very difficult but good question. Again, to be frank, in the al-Shabaab held areas, there is very little that our partners can do, right? If they can't access the area, they can't provide education to the children there. In Somalia, we have a lot of national partners, and of course they do have access to areas that international partners don't always have access to. In that sense, they can reach into some of the borderline areas. But in completely al-Shabaab held areas, there is not much we can do, right? However, and I was alluding to this before, al-Shabaab does run a school system. They have made that very clear. They have launched their curriculum. They have school materials printed. They are educating children in those areas. It can be quite questionable what kind of education the kids are getting, and that's the concerning part, right? And that's where there is a high risk of radicalization and other unfortunate results of, what can I say, non-conflict sensitive education, right? So it's not a particularly good situation, but unfortunately, I think this is perhaps one of the differences between ICRC and some of the other organizations, is that many of our partners can only operate in government held areas, right, due to security in Somalia.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I just point out, I suppose, that you can be pretty heavily radicalized by governments too, in government-held areas. I was educated in Britain, and I was educated to be a real British patriot. It's taken me years to recover. So I'm going to go to Lise now and ask you the same question, Lise. How do you manage to reach children in non-government controlled areas of Yemen?
So the majority of the population of Yemen is actually living in areas that are administered by de facto authorities based here in Sana'a. 80% of the population actually lives in these areas, and we've prioritized access even in areas that are in direct conflict. We have a mechanism called deconfliction, and what we do is we ask the parties to the conflict to respect key facilities. The facilities and the civilian infrastructure that's protected under international humanitarian law. And right at the top of that list are education facilities. So we have literally tens of thousands of locations on a no-strike list. And we say to all of the parties, don't hit these areas. Don't hit them. And the parties, there are violations, yes, but by and large, there is adherence to the no-strike list. And this has allowed us to expand our access. We're continually engaging with authorities to make sure that we can reach as many children as possible. And in the case of Yemen, there are 333 districts, and there are only 12 of those districts, and this is where the most intensive fighting is occurring, that we do not have education access. So in many ways, what we do is, we treat this as a top access problem, we deconflict those sites, and then we treat it as normal. We get in there, keep those schools open, make sure teachers are paid, make sure that there are capitation funds so the schools can operate, get the stationery and the supplies in there, make sure that there are wash facilities so that girl children can go, help teachers to understand their unique responsibilities of educating children in conflict. We do all of that as per normal.
Lise, thank you. That's very helpful. Sarah, one little question has just come in, which I think is important, and it goes back to what we were saying about primary, secondary. What do you do about early learning, the youngest children, and how do you cope with trauma in the youngest children who may have seen, heard, felt, experienced terrible things at a very young age?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question, and unfortunately, in general, in Somalia, there is no early childhood education, which is, I think, a great mistake, because kids in those early ages are very receptive, right? So they do also quite a lot of things. However, there are attempts to try and get it established. It falls a little bit, I'm not entirely sure why, but it falls a little bit onto some of the resilience programs that are happening, where there are attempts to try and get early childhood included together with school feeding programs and looking at a broader approach to education. But unfortunately, it's not a widespread part of the education system in Somalia.
Sarah, thank you. Lise, is it any better in Yemen? Is there early school provision? Early learning provision?
Childhood education. Yeah, this is something which is, honestly, this has been really tough for us to do. And I also want to be frank that we know how important it is to do these kind of psychosocial support programs. Kids are clearly traumatized. There's no question about that. And we've really had to engage with authorities to help everyone understand why this is important and why we need these programs to keep expanding. We do have some programs, and we are continuing to push this agenda, because we know that children that have been subjected to continuous airstrikes and continuous shelling, who are food deprived, who have seen family members killed, who have been displaced multiple times, my goodness, they need support, mentoring, and help. And that's why, for us, this is one of the agenda items we know we have to do better on, and we're committed to that.
That's great. Thank you. Now, we've got 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to ask each of you just to give us one big thing you think the humanitarian sector needs to do, and that can be anyone in it, people, donors, whatever. One big thing we need to do to keep improving education. Sarah, if we could start with your one big thing.
That's a tough one right there. No, I think one thing which at least is frustrating me a lot, and I would therefore like it to be addressed, is that everybody keeps saying education is so important, right? And in order to stop conflicts, in order to rebuild countries, what have you, education is absolutely the cornerstone of doing that. And at the same time, we don't see the commitments throughout the crisis around the world, right? So I find it a little hypocritical that on the one hand side, we all agree that it's important. On the other hand side, the action and the funding and priorities are not necessarily there. So I think maybe that's something we should look a bit at. We being many different levels of the humanitarian community.
Sarah, thank you. That's a good one big thing. Lise, what's your one big thing?
Yeah, I really agree with what Sarah said. I mean, priorities and commitment are reflected in how many resources are actually mobilized. And this is something which is just across the board wholly disappointing. There's a lot of talk about, just like Sarah said, why education is so important. And then when you've actually got to get money for teachers' payrolls, when you've got to get money to reconstruct schools, it's just not there. We've got to be absolutely clear that this is a priority which you've got to fund. When we were raising the money for the payroll, we've been at this for a number of months. And it was persistent, relentless prioritization on our part, holding the feet to the fire of donors who talked about cohesion and giving hope and looking after kids and all of these kinds of things, and then just would put $2 against it instead of the 200 million we needed. And honestly, in Yemen, we just didn't let that happen. We didn't let them get away with it. We kept saying, you've got to put money here, and it's wholly gratified, as I shared earlier, that 2 days ago, for the first time in the middle of an emergency like this, donors have stepped forward and said, you're right, we're with this cluster, we're with the humanitarian country team, we're going to cover those allowances.
Lise, thank you very much for your one big thing too. We must wrap it up now. I just want to say that I've heard three big things. I've heard the big thing that people want it, And if we're going to respond to what people need and want, education is important. I've also heard this key point that education is not just an end in itself, good for people, that it's a means to many other things. So education schools are hubs of multi-entry interventions on health, water, education, all sorts of things. And the last thing I've heard is the challenge of inclusion, that we must try and make sure that schools include everybody across the conflict and ensure that they are safeguarded places as well. So those are my three big things I've heard listening to you both and to the questions. This has been an education for me, so thank you very much. I hope it's been useful for all the 188 people that have been listening. Lise, Sarah, thank you both very much for such a great contribution and getting us going on this topic from your very busy jobs. And here beside me, I want to thank Alice and Venkatesh as well, who have kept me going here. This is the first time I've done a webinar. I was a teacher for many years, and usually I'm used to seeing the faces of people. I haven't seen any of the 200 faces, and I missed that. But I hope you've all got as much from this session as I have. Lise and Sarah, thank you very much, and we must stop there.